We're going to do John Hunt Morgan today. And I failed to, before I got started, to even reset the slide. So we're off and rolling right here, right? What are we going to talk about today? John Hunt Morgan. I thought since we did Nathan Bedford Forrest many years ago, that we would actually do this one. Can we take it back to live feed right now? All right. Oh, there we go. Now, does it work? Oh, yes. So I thought a good bookend, to Nathan Bedford Forrest would be John Hunt Morgan, who is counter the rival to that. If you think about, especially if you go back to the 1950s and you go back to the 1960s, I mean, what was the focus of the TV shows? What was the focus of the comic books and so forth? It was Jeb Stewart. I don't know if you remember what was the name of the comic book where he had the Stewart tank and he had the ghost that came out?
Haunted Tank.
Haunted Tank. Hey, Beth. And so, you get, it was a big deal. And John Hunt Morgan was in there. And Mosby for that matter. When I got to looking into John Hunt Morgan, he struck me as a man that kind of captured everything that you stereotype from Gone with the Wind or the Cavalier or anything else that you might want to imagine. I mean, if you had a knight of old, it would probably be John Hunt Morgan, with all of his virtues and all of his vices, which I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about today. Now, who set the tone in the South, though, before the war? It was none other than this gentleman right here, Sir Walter Scott, who my mother, whose maiden name is Scott, my middle name is Scott, claims we are related to, of course. Right here. And what did he end up through Scott's pen? Quote, history was retold, the past was fictionalized, and present institution mythicized. The never never became a mode for the here and now, and Southerners cast themselves in roles that preserved their honor. They embraced the cult of chivalry to justify slavery, the hierarchical system, and the aristocratic way of life. According to historian James Ramage, which wrote the biography on Morgan, which a lot of this program came from, just to give credit to where credit's due, Scott's book strengthened the chivalric ideal and the code of the country gentleman who is characterized by hospitality, courtesy, deference to women, and defense of honor. I forgot I had another microphone over here. Another of these novels, though, was another point of these novels, though, was guerrilla warfare. And perhaps no other character in the Civil War embodied all those ideals like this gentleman right here, the John Hunt Morgan, Mr. John Hunt Morgan. He was lionized as the Marion of the South, who, if you don't know, was a Revolutionary War hero, American Revolution, which is high praise indeed. Morgan is born in Huntsville, Alabama. Not Muscle Shoals, because they've got the swampers. It was on June 1st of 1825. Okay, that one fell flat. The oldest of 10 children from Henrietta and Calvin Morgan, and John was named after his father-in-law, John Wesley Hunt, who was the money in the family. If I could stress anything, I gotta broach over his childhood here, though. But his father married the money, and then because the money was on the mother's side, then daddy-in-law was son-in-law had to do whatever he wanted. And so his daddy went belly up in the mercantile business in Huntsville, with those depressions and currency speculations, all that. And that's what brought him to Kentucky, because that's where his father-in-law was. And his father-in-law, of course, owned several businesses. His father-in-law was I believe I'm correct, he's the first millionaire west of the mountains. Yeah, of the Alleghenies. Pretty cool. Oh, are you, man? And so, in 1844, John is going to enter Transylvania College, which must have been one heck of a haul to, Romania. That's actually in Kentucky, and none other than some of the alumnus from there in there at the same time were Albert Sidney Johnston and Jefferson Davis. Not the same time as Morgan, but the same time those two gentlemen were in there together. Morgan, when he was there, was a typical college kid. Apparently, he did more extracurricular activities than he did studying, and he even managed to make it 2 years before being suspended for dueling with the fraternity brother. Since his direct family did not have any money, John could not hope to become a planter. It's taught me a lot. Studying John Hunt Morgan taught me a lot about pre-war. The only activity equal to agriculture as far as honor was concerned back then was the military, right? And so that's where he's going to go. This career would fulfill the Morgan legacy of service and give John the chance to defend personal and national honor. Of course, that chance is going to come relatively fast in the Mexican War with the young men rushing to join the colors. And of course, young Morgan was right behind them. He's eventually elected first lieutenant of the 1st Kentucky Mounted Volunteer Regiment. And he saw his first and only combat at the Battle of Buena Vista, which is probably Buena Vista, but in Houston and Chickasaw County, it's Buena Vista. And I want you to know that my daddy saw Jerry Lee Lewis in a tent at a carnival in Buena Vista, Mississippi, in the 1950s, before he was even famous right there. There you go. I haven't told that one before, but that's a true story. You saw Albert King, too. I ran across this sobering figure, though. One thing I want to point out before I move on from Mexico. I never realized this. In the Mexican War, 1,549 men lost their lives in battle. 1,500 men lost their lives in battle. 361 men lost their lives in accidents. And 10,986 men died of illness. That's just crazy. That's just crazy. Now think about that. In 1848, without a military career in sight, Morgan went into the retail business with a gentleman named Sanders Bruce selling china and glassware. The Bruce family lived across the street from Hopemont, which was the name of the Morgan ancestral home, and it's still there, and was considered the Bruce family considered an established manufacturing family, wealthy, successful, and respected. Bruce and Morgan also invested in a few slaves who they rented out on side jobs to haul corn, lumber, and other items. They even had for lack of a better word, a crew that they sent up and down the river on various steamboats. And they would sail up and down, and then when they would have some off time, they would work these various cities. And they were not physically with John Hunt Morgan. In 1848, 23-year-old Morgan married Saunders' 18-year-old sister, Rebecca. And in 1853, 5 years later, she gave birth to a stillborn son. And the resulting pregnancy, or the complications from the pregnancy, resulted in eventually what would kill her. Of course, they came up with some off-the-wall diagnosis. They called her illness milk leg, which the theory was that breast milk had seeped into the leg, giving it a white or pale hue. Hey, I'm just working with what I got here. And of course that's not true, but she probably had some kind of circulation issues. But they tried throughout the 1850s to get her help. And she ends up dying, an easy date to remember, she ends up dying on the day that the Battle of First Manassas is fought, July 21st of 1861. Now, Morgan's millionaire grandfather died in 1849, to back up a little bit, which gave him much more access to capital. All right? In 1853, John Hunt Morgan went into the hemp business. Not marijuana, but hemp right here. Now, I would like you to know, just so I can get my claim to fame, and I have to chase some rabbit at some point in this program right here. I am, of course, in discussing the history of A.P. Hill, I was the first park ranger in the history of the National Park Service to use the word penile. And of course, during the Michael Scher presentation and the article that he published, I believe in 1957, I was the first park ranger to have a slide with a Playboy on it. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I have completed the third P. Thank you. All right. Yes. Okay, so, like many Southern gentlemen of the era, John Hunt Morgan bought and sold slaves, bred racing horses, gambled, fought tube duels, drank, and was noted in many circles as basically as being a libertine. Actually, my favorite Johnny Depp movie. All right? Check it out. They don't show that one on TV. Do not show it with children in there. All right. Morgan's brother-in-law, best friend Basil Duke, expounded the Southern Code of Ethics when he pointed out that Morgan never attempted to be secretive or hypocritical about his diversions. And he never did anything, quote, which touched his integrity as a man and his honor as a gentleman. After the war, Duke wrote, like the great majority of the men of his class, notice how he puts this, the gentlemen of the South, he lived freely, and the amusements he permitted himself would, doubtless, have shocked a New Englander almost as much as the money he spent in obtaining them. General Morgan, with the virtues, had some of the faults of his Southern blood and country. So what does that mean? He's basically Rhett Butler. All right, if you want a movie character. Ironically, though, despite the lavish lifestyle, Morgan apparently suffered from bouts of depression from time to time. So he is, human after all. Through all the 1850s, though, he continued to dabble in military-related things. He became part of the Kentucky, what we would call the Kentucky National Guard. They called it the Militia back then. He was actually formed an artillery company in 1852. The governor soon dissolved the militia, and basically that dissolved the artillery company, but Morgan then, a couple years later, went into formed an infantry company, and they would go around to parades and barbecues and stuff and form up a parade around and so forth. So, he's involved in the military. He keeps it up even past the Mexican War. So was there any doubt, ladies and gentlemen, when what he and his comrades would do in 1861? As war loomed, they began to drill in earnest. And Fort Sumter drew the war fever to a high pitch, but Kentucky remained neutral, and therefore most of her sons also. With his woolen factories, hemp factories still in operation, he started making cloth for militia companies across the state. And still, even with the first Battle of Manassas, Morgan stayed home because Kentucky remained neutral. It was not until September of 1861 that he entered the fray when Union and Confederate forces violated Kentucky's neutrality. Now, Morgan quickly, as far as, of course, he's going to go into the cavalry, and he quickly adopts a type of guerrilla-style warfare. You've also got, when you put together a PowerPoint, always keep in mind that if you can find somebody that really likes themselves, you're usually guaranteed of a lot of pictures. And so what you're going to see here today are a lot of pictures of John Hunt Morgan that you've never seen before, because he liked to get his picture took, which makes my program a whole lot easier. thankfully, which he probably had in mind when he did it. Steady as she goes, Stuff Rider. Now, never shying away from impersonating a Union officer or adopting the other side's uniform. What is the penalty for being caught in somebody else's uniform? Yes, drumhead court-martial. He thrived on the excitement. In an engagement, Morgan is perfectly cool, related one soldier, quote, and yet his face in action as if surcharged with electricity. He had the quickness of a tiger and the strength of two ordinary men. His friend, confidant, and aide, Basil Duke, recalled that Morgan's voice would change during an engagement and take on a more forceful manner. Quote, his presence of mind and address in the midst of a great and imminent danger was literally perfect. He had, quote, a quality even higher than courage. I can describe it only as the faculty of subjecting everyone to his will whom he tried to influence. It was almost mesmeric. One of these days I'm not going to get one of these words. Over time, Morgan's men discarded the saber for the pistol and the infantry rifles, along with Nathan Bedford Forrest's men. They got rid of all that. They just found it useless. They carried little or as little as possible, and they traveled fast. His artillery usually consisted of 2 mountain howitzers for each brigade, and the only conveyance was the only conveyance with wheels in the whole command. Which, for you Gettysburg people, mountain howitzers like what, a quarter size of a normal cannon out here? Very light, probably what, 500, 600 pounds. Horses provided maximum mobility and the ability to employ, quote, the hit and run. When his command had to fight, they fought as infantrymen. In intelligence gatherings, he had few superiors. Scouts always rode ahead of the column, and locals were told in advance to prepare to feed his command or guide them on some back road. He employed a full-time telegraph operator on his staff. He used the communication system to sow disinformation while gathering his own intelligence. Morgan also was known to send personal messages on occasion to various Union officers and editors through the telegraph that drew his ire. If he saw an article that he did not appreciate, he would make sure once he reached a Union telegraph line that he telegraphed Louisville and told the editor that he sucked. That's not a quote. On the march, he kept a series of rolling guards, edit that out, on his flanks to guard against any surprises, always leapfrogging them forward as the column came abreast. See what he's doing? Column moves forward, guards are out several miles on the end, so on the flank, so nobody can get to him without him knowing about it. There are no surprises. No surprises. No surprises. Feints in different directions also clouded his true objectives. Now, after, the Confederates basically get kicked out of Kentucky, Morgan falls back primarily along the Green River until the Battle of Mill Springs in January of '62. His command will help evacuate Nashville, when would that be? The next month in February, and continue to harass the occupying Union Army for the next month. By the end of February of '62, he's in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He was promoted to colonel to date from April 4th of 1862. Now to give you an idea of the kind of person you're dealing with though, right now, at the Battle of Shiloh, Morgan almost misses it because he decides somewhere around the last week of March that he's just going to go to Richmond, with permission or not. To Richmond, Virginia, not Richmond, Kentucky. All right, so he boards a train, he gets all the way up, he's on the way, and then he receives word that there's a battle is imminent. And you know what? My uncle told me that was in the Navy, you can do a lot of things, but don't miss the ship. Well, Morgan had to do high time back down, and he barely made it back to Corinth in order to make the Battle of Shiloh. For the most part, though, he's pretty much on the outskirts. And it's really, I don't know if it's telling because it's one of Morgan's first battles and he doesn't have any orders, and I'm not saying he disobeys or he's sheltering, but to try to show you a little bit of difference, Nathan Bedford Forrest seeks action. Morgan does not. Now, when you get, I don't know, I guess you could loosely call Nathan Bedford Forrest a guerrilla fighter, but John Hunt Morgan is a guerrilla fighter. Guerrilla fighters try at all costs to avoid pitched combat. I'm not saying that's the mentality he had at Shiloh. He basically gets squeezed out on the edge, but he's not going out trying to get people shot, or trying to find somebody to shoot, I should say, like Nathan Bedford Forrest. He commands about 325 men there at Shiloh. From July 4th, fast forwarding to the 28th of 62, one thing before I leave this print. I once gave, this is Mort Kunstler print right here. I once gave this to a friend of mine as a Christmas gift because he's a big John S. Mosby fan. And he later told me that it's not John Mosby. But I had good intentions. I just want you to know. Right there. Just saying. All right. He goes off on this first Kentucky raid. And as you can see, he makes a big circle through the state. And he nets about 300 new recruits while eluding a 3,000-man Union force that was in his pursuit. The people in Kentucky, the Union authorities raised all kind of cane. They got on the telegraph to Washington, D.C., prompting President Abraham Lincoln to wire back, quote, "They are having a stampede in Kentucky. Please look to it." Now this is important. This is the reason I'm mentioning this aid. This is July of 62. Morgan's glowing report on how the locals came out to welcome his command is going to be one of the big impetus behind Braxton Bragg's invasion of Kentucky later that fall, because Morgan told him that Kentuckians were ready to be liberated. That all comes from this raid right here. And Bragg, of course, is very confused when it doesn't happen. Now, fast forwarding a little bit, Buell's, that's the Union general's army at Nashville, main Union army was supplied by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. Morgan found out that the Achilles tendon of this long railroad running from Louisville to Nashville lay in 2 tunnels near Gallatin, Tennessee. Now, despite being defended by 375 infantry, in August, Morgan is going to go up there, riding through the night so he will appear at dawn. That was a favorite tactic of his, always to appear at dawn, so he would have as much light as possible in the edge of surprise. He gets up there, and without firing a shot, he captures the entire Union garrison. The important thing, and of course you've read the sign by now, is that he destroys both those tunnels, and it shuts down the Union Railroad supply line for 98 days. Which, if you don't have a railroad line and you got an army the size of these Civil War armies, you can't move. You can't move without tonnage. And you can't have tonnage without a railroad. And so this delays the Union advance for several months because Morgan's was successful in this. I'm pointing this out to you because I think this is Morgan's greatest impact on the Civil War right here. This raid that goes forward. Now, Morgan's command continued to grow. In December of 62, he led a surprise offensive of 2,140 men against Union General Absalom Moore's brigade of 2,100 at Hartsville, Tennessee. In a frontal assault on December 7th, Morgan lost 21 men and another 104 wounded. However, he inflicted 58 killed, 204 wounded, and captured 1,834 men in one of the most lopsided victories of the war. We might as well take this opportunity, since he's coming back from the bathroom, to welcome Matt Callery. Let's have a round of applause of addressing Gettysburg, who failed to be prepared for this program right here, Addressing Gettysburg, is the only podcast on the Battle of Gettysburg right here, and he and his whole crew are occupying this front row. And I have a special surprise from one of the crew that's going to take place 10 minutes after the end of this program. You won't want to miss it. Right here. Addressing Gettysburg. Okay. Now, where were we? With the energy of two men, Morgan had no sooner returned to Murfreesboro when he embarked on what became known as the Christmas Raid from December 22nd to January 1st, 1863. The objective was to destroy two trestles on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad north of Elizabethtown, Kentucky. His division now numbering 3,900 men. You noticing how this command keeps growing? Keeps growing. From Shiloh, he had 300. December, he's got 3,900. He successfully destroyed two trestles, leaving the railroad out of commission for 5 weeks, while also tying up an additional 7,300 Union troops to help guard the rest of the railroad. As a result of his actions, these 7,300 Union troops were not at the Battle of Stones River. See what he's doing? You don't always have to fight a battle in order to aid the larger army. You can do that through other means. During these latter raids of 1862, Morgan exhibited a more reckless abandonment, taking more chances, engaging in frontal assaults, and overall showing less patience. One of the reasons behind this change may have been the same thing that vexed General Richard Ewell after the Battle of Second Manassas. John Hunt Morgan was lovesick. I got a feeling called the blues. Oh Lord, since the baby said goodbye. Now, Southern soldiers used to get ready to print for the march. That's the exact quote. Past the house of Colonel Charles Reddy, where his beautiful 4 daughters resided. The ladies used to appear on the veranda and wave their handkerchiefs at the passing men. The second daughter was named Martha, and her good friends called her Maddie to her close acquaintances. She had a trim figure with dark brown hair, fair complexion, rosy cheeks, gray eyes, and sparkling with intelligence and strength. An admirable deportment, well-educated, amiable, and pleasant, with a perfect posture and an age they wouldn't divorce you. I thought that was funny. All right. She had a coquettish demeanor. And when her father was a congressman in Washington, she set the trend by being the first lady to wear a curl on her forehead. Something that I can readily appreciate. They got engaged on March 19th of 1862. And on December 14th of 1862, the couple was wed at her parents' home in Murfreesboro. And this is probably the who's who of the weddings in the Confederate. I would say the West. How about that? We probably got some in Richmond that would be up there. But as far as the West, I don't know how you beat this lineup. It featured Colonel George St. Leger Greenfell, an English officer of fortune, as one of the groomsmen. Corps Commander General Leonidas Pope as the bishop who was marrying everybody, who was the Episcopal bishop of the Diocese of Louisiana. I guess that's about as officially married as you can get officially married. Generals Bragg, Hardy, Cheatham, and Breckinridge all came too. 2 regimental bands provided the music, and thousands of soldiers gathered outside and cheered lustily. The dinner reception featured turkeys, hams, chickens, ducks, game, and other delicacies. Fine wine was provided by Colonel Reddy's steel stock cellar. You know how hard it was to find some Madeira by the December of 62, if things could not get any better, John Hunt Morgan was promoted to Brigadier General the day before. That's when you roll it. Right there. Got a bride and he got a promotion. Morgan stayed near Maddie for all that winter and into early spring. All right. And let me say, I'm gonna come back to her later. But you know, when I said love struck earlier, I mean, we've all read about people that have been in love. Where do you even start with that throughout history? But John Hunt Morgan and her have got such a passionate love affair that it alters his behavior. You start seeing his command decisions, or let me give you an example. The raids don't go as long. Everything is built around the idea of how fast can I get back to her. It is. And he's willing to take more risk in order to do that. But he doesn't like to be separated from them. You want me to read you a juicy quote here? He wrote her and he said, "I am determined to have you near me." And once she was near there, Maddie wrote her relative, "My life is all a joyous dream now, from which I fear to awaken, and awake I must when my hero," that's capitalized, "is called to leave me again. My husband wants me to remain with him, and of course I much prefer it." Now during this time period, Union cavalry is going to start to grow stronger and become more bolder. In a series of probes, that whole war thing always gets in the way of this romance. In a series of probes, they began to defeat Morgan's increasingly weaker command until morale and efficiency started to wane. And Morgan himself is going to be running into various problems. As I get up here. So, all right, well, this is what you call winging it. All right, so this causes him to keep going further and further and further toward. I don't know what I did with these notes. Right here.
Yep, okay.
No, that's Kim. Right here. Oh God. Well, I can't explain it.
You were saying something about efficiency.
I was. I really was. I swear to God. I swear to God. All right. Oh well. Well, I guess we're gonna wing it, huh? He starts though. Morgan starts taking more and more aggressive posture. He starts going up into Kentucky and he starts coming back down. When he starts doing that, ladies and gentlemen, the Union cavalry is getting closer and closer and closer to him. Now, what is the same thing that John Hunt Morgan has that Jeb Stuart has, or all these great men have? John Hunt Morgan and Jeb Stuart, just trying to relate it here to Gettysburg, both have an ego. And when the Union cavalry, they start seeking Morgan out. Morgan is actually, in the winter of 62, supposed to be guarding the flank of Braxton Bragg's army. And the Union army is crossing the river and is seeking him out, the Cumberland River, and trying to bring him to an engagement. And there's really nothing he can stop him with. If I always think of John Hunt Morgan's command as being similar to, like Turner Ashby's, where he's a great leader and he's very revered by his men, but nevertheless he cannot control them, or he doesn't put much emphasis on control them. So when they go up against hardened Union cavalry, they're not doing that well. Going back to Jeb Stuart, all of this Union forays and so forth, and the lack of Morgan doing anything because he won't leave Maddie. He don't want to get too far away from her. Starts making the press talk bad about John Hunt Morgan. And when that starts to happen, ladies and gentlemen, when you got somebody like an ego like John Hunt Morgan's, he wants both. He wants the love and he wants the attention. And he's a gambler. What did I tell you about in his earlier life? He is a gambler. He would, horses, ventures, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is why it's going to be that he's going to try to attempt to go and try to catch some more headlines in July of 1863. And so you see the start of the beginning of this raid down here at the bottom at Sparta, Tennessee. And they start going up through here and all the way up. Now let's back this up a little bit. John Hunt Morgan is under orders to go into Kentucky. He originally is allowed to have 1,500 men to take on this raid. He requests 2,000. 1,500 men can go up here, and what Braxton Bragg thinks he's going to do is take Louisville right here, or at least threaten it if he doesn't do it. What does that do? That draws the Union troops off of Bragg and all the way up through this railroad, which I don't have through here. Well, Morgan comes back, as I said, he requests 2,000 men to go. Bragg allows him 2,000 men, and then Morgan, to show you the mentality of this guy, decides he'll take 2,500, or basically his whole command. Now this is where it gets real tricky, and you can get, on John Hunt Morgan, you find mixed opinions. Braxton Bragg told him, you're going to Louisville. That's where you're going. And you're going to raid that railroad. John Hunt Morgan never had any intentions of going to Louisville. He needed 2,500 men because 1,500 can do Louisville, but 2,500 can take you where? Can take you all the way up into Indiana, right? And that's what he's aiming to do. They're going to take him up into Indiana. And so, that's where he heads. Now the Union column, they're getting used to Morgan coming up into Kentucky. They send a column of 3,000 Union cavalry to try to cut him off in central Kentucky, but they're moving too fast. Now I don't have it on here, but right in the middle of Kentucky is a river called the Green River. And they get to the Green River before the Union troops do, and they cut them off before they can cut them off. And once Morgan is across through here, he fords the Green River. Of course, he destroys the ferries, which puts more time between him and that pursuing Union column. Eventually, they're going to get to Bradenburg right up here, and they're going to get to the Ohio River. Now, there's not a bridge at Bradenburg. There's not. So what is he going to do? He's going to flag over some steamboats. Why? Because that's the last thing they ever expect is Confederates on the Ohio River. And so he gets 2 steamboats to come over. He pull over to the Ohio River, and he forwards his command across through there. All the way over. Can you imagine how long that took? It took him almost 24 hours in order to accomplish that. But can you imagine putting 2,500 people into the middle of enemy territory? He's going to do that. And then deciding that he's going to take off across Ohio. I don't know. He's gambling, to say the least. He left Braxton Bragg's right flank wide open, but he's pulling Union cavalry with him. Now he crosses Bradenburg. He gets into here. He fights a short, I don't want to call them, glorify them as battles. He fights a skirmish with about 1,000 militia right here outside. How do you say that? Cordon? Cordon? and he goes up through here. Now look what he does. He splits his command up. He faints in different ways, in different areas. They actually had a woodcut of his command entering Salem. I don't know if you can read that, but that's them entering right through here. And what is he doing? He's throwing the command off. What is that telegraph operator doing? He's getting on the telegraph lines and he's sending word to Louisville that what is Morgan doing? He's headed where? He is headed toward Cincinnati, or he is headed toward Louisville. All right, so what are the Union forces doing? They're going in the wrong direction. Now, you like that? That's not Clint Eastwood. What's the only movie John Wayne was a Confederate? True Grit?
It's True Grit, yeah.
Was it True Grit? No, it was The Searchers.
Oh, Searchers too. Both.
True Grit, he was a former Confederate. Comancheros, he was a
He's in horse
searcher. He was former Confederate.
That's John Wayne. He has an airport named after him. Union cavalry's in pursuit of John Hunt Morgan. 3,000 men are going to pull up right next to Bradenton, Kentucky. And they're going to be, we're hot on the trail of John Hunt Morgan as they're coming out through here. When he crosses into Indiana, instantly, ladies and gentlemen, the governor of Indiana is going to call out who? The militia. And they're going to start in hot pursuit. What they're going to be trying to do, ladies and gentlemen, is corner him in. And so crossing here, ladies and gentlemen, you can see the route now. They're coming up through here and all the way through Indiana. See them headed towards Cincinnati? Right through here. All right, so 3,000 Union troops are on his tail. He's got roughly around 60 to 65,000 of Indiana militiamen that are forming. I'm not saying they're in front of him, and I'm not saying they're in southern Indiana, but that is what is eventually called up in order to combat him right here. And so they just keep galloping. In a matter of 6 days, they cover 186 miles. You can average that out. That's a lot of bulls, to say the least. As they're coming across Indiana, they're wearing out the horse stock, and they're going to replenish it. So where are you going to get horses from? Now this is where it was interesting to me. The horses, ladies and gentlemen, are going to come obviously from Indiana. But what is Kentucky known for? Known for horse flesh. And Indiana is not. So what are the type horses that John Hunt Morgan is getting?
Plow horse.
That's right. He's getting draft horses. He's getting plow horses. And nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, these horses can't stay up with men that are galloping approximately 30 miles a day. They just can't do it. He also apparently at some point, going through one of these towns, he comes across a pork factory, and he and his men steal hundreds of hams. And so as the Union pursuers are trying to find him across Indiana, as the hams got hot and they started to rot, the men started to discard the hams, and so what do? The Union pursuers follow the hams. Down the road. Yeah. Yeah. So they're after him. On the morning of July 18th, Morgan sensed, oh, by the way, that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you fill in for 2 pages of missing information. That is called a high wire act without a net. Totally off. And I'm actually back on time. All meant to do that. On the morning of July 18th, Morgan sensed the pursuit closing in on him, and Morgan turned east from Haynesville and headed toward Middleport. Right on there? in an effort to reach the Ohio River in friendly territory. So he's headed through here. He's being harrowed by now. These horses are starting to give out. Heavy resistance, though, along the way convinced Morgan to ford the Ohio further upstream at a place called Buffington Island. Upon arrival that evening, the Confederates discovered a small contingent of Ohio militia guarding the crossing. There was a delay before the militia retreated, and now Morgan discovered the Ohio itself, at almost flood stage. These two things combined to allow the Union pursuit to close. On the foggy morning of July 19th, Henry Judah, who was in command of that Union cavalry pursuing Morgan, finally caught up with him. And his 1,100 troopers attacked from the north at Buffington Island, while simultaneously Edward Hobson and his 450 troopers closed from the west. In the initial fighting, Major Daniel McCook, the 65-year-old father of the famous Fighting McCooks, was mortally wounded, and Judah's vanguard was surprised and routed. By 6:30, 2 brigades of dismounted men from Hobson's division attacked from the west, while Judah's reformed men drove in from the north. The Union artillery of both federal pincers created a crossfire that was very effective. Here's the guns down here, and there's the guns up here. So you see what they're doing? They're shooting this way and they're shooting this way. And the Confederates are trying to, well, this is not a good position. And what are these little things right here?
Gunboats.
Gunboats. That's not good either. Especially if you're in red. Right there. So, Morgan deployed his men in an L-shaped defensive line while he tried to extricate his men out to the north, which is the top of the map. 2 Union gunboats, the USS Moose and the Allegheny Belle, lent their mettle to the fray from the rear. The best data suggests that Morgan lost 57 killed, 63 wounded, and 71 captured here, including his brother-in-law, Basil Duke. If you're looking to name a child, over here, if you're looking to name a child, I suggest Basil. What a name, right there. Even looks like a basil. Another 570 cavalrymen were captured in the next 24 hours along the escape route. What is that from? The horses are giving out. It's catching them. And Morgan's remaining men, numbering about 1,100 of the 1,800 engaged, continued in a northerly direction along the Ohio River. So we started here, and all the way through here, skirted Cincinnati, got to Buffington Island, and then when they can't cross the river, what are they doing? They're turning this way. They're going up this way. About 12 miles upstream at Reedsville, 300 Confederates managed to cross the Ohio to safety. Now I like this about John Hunt Morgan. He's in the middle of the stream, trying to cross his command. As I said just a second ago, 300 have already crossed, and the Union gunboats show up. Now the rest of his command, what is that, approximately 1,500 men, are on the Ohio shore. John Hunt Morgan's in the middle of the river, and John Hunt Morgan, instead of going into West Virginia, turns back and goes into Ohio, because that's where the majority of his men are. He did not desert his men. That is why, the reason I'm pointing this out to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that is the reason that these men will follow John Hunt Morgan across the Ohio River, because they believed in him. He would never go anywhere he would never send them anywhere he would not go personally. And so he turns back around. Now you watch what happens to him as a result of this decision. The remnants of 800 men eventually turned north toward Benton, Hocking, Athens, Perry, Morgan. Where's my Ohio friend over there? Muskingum, Noble, Guernsey, there we go. Harrison, Jefferson, Carroll, and Columbiana counties. And stay out of Franklin. Along the way, Morgan fought Union soldiers and Ohio militia at Cheshire, Eagleport, Washington, and Wintersville. None of these skirmishes were decisive, but Morgan continued to lose men who could not keep up with the fast pace. Southwest of Salonsville, Union cavalry under the command of Major W.B. Way engaged in a running battle with Morgan's men that cost 100 more in killed, wounded, and captured of his remaining 475. 3 miles west of West Point in Columbiana County, Major G.W. Rue's Union cavalry surrounded Morgan's remaining men and captured the general and 364 of his command. The capitulation occurred about 2 p.m. on July 26, 1863. In the end, the raid tied up 100,000 Union troops from their normal routine for 3 weeks and delayed the advance of General Burnside into East Tennessee. It also gave a much-needed morale boost to the Confederacy civilians right after Vicksburg and Gettysburg. The raid struck fear in the minds of Ohioans and Indianans, along with 4,400 Ohioans alone that filed property damage claims. Here, wait a minute, don't put your phone up. You want a picture of this too. Right there. Amounting to $678,915, of which, to show you what I can do with notes, the government paid $576,225 worth of claims. However, the raid overall did not cause any significant harm to the transportation and communication sectors. And of course, the Confederacy lost 2,400 cavalrymen to boot, which is very hard to replace. At the insistence of the Ohio governor, the 68 Confederate officers from Morgan's command were housed in the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus like common criminals. This turned out to be, though, the first big break for Morgan and his men because they had better living conditions and quote-unquote more freedom, that's not an oxymoron, than a military prison, at least at first. Now, Morgan and his officers were incarcerated in a building 400 feet in length and 40 odd feet wide with approximately maybe 40 feet in height. Individual cells were about, now you think about this, individual cells were 3.5 feet wide and 7 feet long. Yeah. Prisoners were confined in their cells from 7 o'clock at night to breakfast. And they were punished for the slightest infractions. One of the things that probably drove John Hunt Morgan mad is they used to deliver, the mail would come in and for the officers, and they would give them the empty envelopes. Oh yeah. They don't treat you right in Ohio. So I was over at the James Garfield house. Very nice staff. They were having Civil War weekend. And so I'm over there, and I'm there for the black powder. They're shooting some muskets over there. So I have with me at the event, one of the groups was the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, which I'm giving you a nice shout out right now, okay? So this guy tells me this story while I'm at the Garfield house. So he has on his tag, because he's the captain, right? He has on his tag the abbreviation because he's really proud. 8 OVI, all right? So he tells me this story that he's in Ohio one day and he's sitting at this red light and he says this hippie pulls up beside him in this van And apparently in Ohio, they don't call them DUIs, they call them OVIs. And this hippie pulls up beside him and rolls down the window, and he leans out the window and he goes, "Yeah, man, flown it, dude, flown it." Thank you. What'd that have to do with anything? There you go, OVI. This is misunderstanding. So the weeks rocked along, and various escape plans, as you can imagine, were debated and cast aside. But one day, fellow raider Captain Thomas Hines noticed that his bottom level cell floor stayed dry. Interesting. Cell floor stays dry. No moisture. Why is that? So he had a hunch that there must be an air shaft somewhere underneath there. His suspicions were soon confirmed by small talk with the deputy warden. After reading Les Miserables, did I say that right? Hines came about with a plan to tunnel out, and General Morgan approved the plan and laughingly referred to Hines as, quote, the Count of Monte Cristo. Little classic literature here for you and everything. All right. Table knives were stolen. This is actually a picture of Morgan's men in the prison, by the way. Table knives were stolen from the mess hall and sharpened to punch through the concrete floor, with lookouts posted, of course, to warn of the guards coming up. I failed to look up there and see if you were looking at that phone or not. You weren't, are you, Garrick? Sorry about that. Hines began digging on November 4th. What did he discover? 6 inches of concrete with another 6 layers of bricks beneath this. You can get through it. You want to. They disposed of the smaller debris inside handkerchiefs, while the larger pieces were hidden inside Hines' mattress. Dust and mortar pieces were put inside, well, that was a lumpy mattress one. Dust and mortar pieces were put inside the coal stove. They start tunneling out of there. From the main tunnel, he's digging toward the yard, okay, which is the interior of the prison. He's not digging to the outside of the prison. He's digging toward the inside of the prison. Well, once they got the tunnel done, let's say that the wall he's aiming for is over here. Well, they're digging this main tunnel. Let's say they have to go 7 or 8 feet. You have to make it big enough to put to allow a man through there. Well, if this is the cell that I'm standing in, of course, then the adjacent cells will be to the left and the right, okay? And so what would they do? Once they finished that, they started tunneling to the left and the right. And they started tunneling in this direction. They started tunneling in this direction. But this is where it differed from the first. The men in the other cells that were adjacent to them never broke through the concrete. There was only one hole that was allowed for the tunnel. That was in Hines' cell. So everybody, they had various diggers, 5 or 6 men doing it. They worked in shifts. But they would descend into there and they would work, I don't know what their shift was, an hour or two, and in between guard rotations. And they eventually, I don't know how they measured it, but they eventually got the tunnels under those adjacent cells. This all comes into play when they get ready to spring it. All right? So they started this thing on November 4th, and they finished it on November 24th. Yeah, they moved it. Hines had a carpet bag with him. Apparently he was allowed to keep that, which is basically their period suitcase. And he kept the carpet bag over the hole that was open. But all it took was a guard coming in there and inspecting the cell for them to discover the tunnel, but it never happened. And I'm going back, I forgot I had that. It's going back to, being in a state prison. In a military prison, that probably would never happen. What's the one thing you don't do? At an AA meeting. There's the guy that went to the AA meeting. All right, so they get these tunnels done. Since only the officers on the first floor could escape, the following 6 were chosen: General Morgan, Tom Hines, Ralph Sheldon, Sam Taylor, L.D. Hockersmith, Jacob Bennett, and J.S. McGee. Dummies were prepared out of stuffed pillows, much like right there. What do you think of that, yeehaw? You like that, huh? Mm-hmm. And old Hines left behind a note, which I'm sure went over like a lead balloon. With a change of commandants coming soon and fresh inspections on the way, the night of November 27th was chosen as the time to break out of the prison. Fortunately for Morgan and his cohorts, it rained, making the guards and the dogs to seek shelter. The men broke through the concrete to the air tunnel, slipped inside, and crawled to the main shaft. What do I mean by that? The people in the adjacent cells, the soldiers in those cells, did not break through the floor into the tunnel until the night of November 27th. So that floor was intact all the way up until that point. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's how they hit it. All right, so they broke through the concrete, slipped inside, and crawled to the main shaft. Then they made their way to the yard, breaking through the last few inches of earth. They were outside their building and making their way across the yard. Anybody want to, I didn't read this to you because I didn't want to slaughter that French. Does anybody know what it says? Patience is something. Fruit of, I guess, patience.
Patience is.
Well, so much for you learned people. Somebody will write me, right? Tell me. Making their way across the yard, they used a rope with a modified fireplace iron as a hook to scale the inner wall. And once they all got up on the inner wall, they pulled the rope up and they used the rope to scale down the other wall. And they made their way through the prison. I tried to get an overview, but I could never find a map of what the penitentiary would have looked like. But somehow they made, so I don't exactly know the exact route, but somehow they made their way to the women's section and the gate that led into that area. And that's where they made their final escape. They threw the hook over the gate, shimmied up, got everybody over, and then they discovered that they could not get the hook off. And it's dangling on the wall. And so they had a conundrum. Do you crawl up there, make all this noise trying to get that hook off, or you're outside the prison, do you start booking it? Well, I want you to imagine right now, ladies and gentlemen, can you imagine how those eardrums, how much adrenaline was going off in those guys' ears right now? Crazy. But the Raiders were outside. Absolutely, positively, you could put that movie on with 15 minutes left and I will watch it. Absolutely a fantastic movie. I don't care who you are. Right there. If you haven't seen it, I won't do anything. Get busy living. Okay, so when the men got outside, they split up and they shucked their homemade loose outer garments to reveal civilian clothes and then went their separate ways. Morgan had managed to hide away some currency when he entered prison, and he used $15 of that hidden currency to bribe a guard beforehand to obtain a train schedule. I mean, if a prisoner hands you $15, which is a lot of money back then, and he doesn't ask for a poster of Raquel Welch. Morgan partnered, when they split up, Morgan partnered with Captain Hines. The indomitable captain had previously written a sister in Kentucky, and she had sent a book. Somehow they got a code going. And she sent a book that also had cash secreted in it. Somewhere they glued it back on and everything. And so, yeah, it's pretty cool. And so he had a little cash on it. The two went down to the train station and bought a train ticket for Cincinnati. Would you think this was going to be some bold escape dashing across? No, they're going to ride the train. They don't want to sweat. Upon boarding, Morgan sat down by a Union major who cordially offered him a sip of brandy. As the train left town, the major pointed at the penitentiary and said, "That's where Morgan's men were there." Morgan reportedly retorted, "I hope they will keep him as safe as he is now." Now, nearing Cincinnati at dawn, Morgan and Hines feared that their escape had been detected by now, and so they jumped off the train early on the outskirts of town and made their way to Ludlow Ferry on the Ohio River. There they paid for a skiff ride across the river and into somewhat friendly Kentucky. Southern sympathizers took it from there, and eventually Morgan reached the Confederate lines at Dalton, Georgia. Upon his return, Morgan was hailed as the returning hero. Even the Yankees couldn't hold him in prison, they said, not even a penitentiary. And John eventually made his way to Maddie, and I'm sure they had a warm reunion. What are y'all laughing about? I still want to believe. I do. Maddie had given birth to, check this out, Maddie had given birth to a baby girl the day that Morgan escaped from prison. But, unfortunately, the baby died. Only you would appreciate that. They pledged to each other after that to never be separated again. In January of '64, I think this is where this picture is taken, the couple went to Richmond, Virginia for a 3-month stay where they were feted everywhere. And folks, when I say feted, I'm talking about mobbed. I'm talking about having to have somebody get in between them so they could get out the door type stuff. You know, I'm talking about laying in your bed and having crowds chant for you to come out on the balcony type stuff. You know, I mean, this guy was a celebrity. And, you know, probably didn't buy a drink the whole time he was there. But everything has to come to an end. And if you recall what I said earlier, Braxton Bragg didn't tell him to go do that. And, you know, they're going to do something about that. So they're going to send him to Saltville, Virginia, which is near Abington, which is somewhere near where Bristol, which is basically what you call backwater in there, which we're going to learn about here shortly, of course, ribbons and all. Now, that's where he goes. One of the most undesirable locations in the South. People were shocked by the haggard appearance and physical health of Morgan. His reconstituted command, and I don't mean that personally, I mean his military command, did not contain at this time the same quality of soldiers as the pre-raid days from Ohio. He had lost his best men. And I hate to tell you this, but it's pretty much true of any war. The longer a war goes, the quality of soldier generally goes down. If you look at the Roman Empire, if you look at the American Civil War, my ancestor entered in '64, whatever. So, I don't know, write me any letters here. You look at Ukraine, and so the soldiers which Morgan had in '64, they're you know. Some of his command conducted raids throughout the summer and into the East Tennessee and Kentucky. Morgan went up one last time. But during these raids, they were essentially pillaging and inflicting numerous civilian casualties. On June 8th of 1864, soldiers robbed a bank in Mount Sterling, Kentucky of $72,000. Throughout August of '64, Morgan attempted to clear his name from an impending court-martial for not investigating the robbery. I wonder why he didn't investigate. And on August 30th, he was suspended from command by the Confederate War Department. Well, it's just that's not going to get in the way of a good story, right? So Morgan just ignores the order. And on September the 3rd, he takes his command east to Greenville, Tennessee, where they established headquarters. In the early hours of September 4th, 1864, the same day that Atlanta, Georgia fell, Federal cavalry raided the town, and Morgan was shot as he resisted capture in the garden outside the house. Now, it is rumored, there's a lot of theories that go into that, ladies and gentlemen, but it is some people say that, for instance, one of the last telegrams, or maybe the last telegram that Morgan sent Maddie, he put the code word in there, I'm not going to get this right, mitzvah, which is, I'm getting to some arcane Old Testament right here, but it's where a pact was made in the Old Testament. And some historians feel that what that meant was that Morgan had agreed that they would never be captured again. So when the Union cavalry surprised him at this house in Greenville, Tennessee, his staff, they throw up his arms, but Morgan takes off running. And he's shot, as you can see, where that X is. They pretty much they paraded him around, cut souvenirs off of him. You can still find swatches of his pajamas, they cut little swatches and sent him home and so forth. And threw him over the back of a mule and paraded him around town. He was threw him in a ditch eventually. But you can imagine, my point is, what kind of shape John Hunt Morgan's body was in when it returned to Maddie. I mean, this is her hero, to wrap this love story up right here. I mean, this is how they come out, how they come back. The following day, his body was transported under a flag of truce back to his wife in Abington, Virginia, where his first funeral was held. A week later, thousands of mourners attended a state funeral in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. And Maddie went from wife to widow in 630 days. Yeah. 7 months later, after John Hunt Morgan's death, Maddie bore a daughter and named that daughter Johnny. What else? 2 days before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. In 1868, Morgan's brother transported his body back to Lexington. I might add that this Thomas Morgan, that was on page 7, was killed on the Ohio Raid 2 in Kentucky in a skirmish as they were headed toward the Ohio River. Ironic, isn't it? But anyway, in 1868, Morgan's other brother transported his body back to Lexington, where nearly 2,000 people attended a third funeral at Lexington Cemetery on April 17th of 1868. And I thank President Wayne Motts for that picture right there. So what are we to say about John Hunt Morgan? It's the old debate, ladies and gentlemen, of what the Southern people needed and what they had to have in order to remain a viable nation. There are some historians that feel that here at Gettysburg, we have this debate sometimes about whether the South should have stayed on the defensive. James Longstreet comes to mind about that. Whether they should have stayed on the defensive and wore the North down. There are other historians that feel that the Southern people would have never tolerated a defensive-minded war, that the Southern people were more offensive-minded people. In other words, they wanted aggressive generals. If you go back to the beginning of the talk, and you take Sir Walter Scott, and you take the Cavalier days and this romantic, old South, you know, Gone with the Wind type nostalgia of, or look at it, John Hunt Morgan is going to embody that. He's everything that you want to do. When you dream of being a soldier, you don't dream of slogging 15 miles a day in a wool uniform with your feet hurting, carrying 30 pounds of gear while it's raining on you, and you've got lice all over you. You picture yourself as a dashing cavalier who's going to come out of galloping into town with the ladies flaunting their handkerchiefs from the windows right there as you gallop on by, heralding your arrival. Glory, people. Glory is what you seek, or is what you dream of until you meet the stark reality of war. John Hunt Morgan never left that. Despite war, you know how they all go off in 1861. In 1864, he's still hunting that glory. In 1863, he's breaking out of a a state penitentiary. I mean, what more do you want out of life? Right? And so, because of that, ladies and gentlemen, you get a statue. Or you used to get a statue. I don't know where they put him now. That's that right there. But anyway, I thought that you might find it interesting. This door, one last thing, I'll let you go. This door right here, ladies and gentlemen, is that president of the Gettysburg Foundation, Wayne Motts. They tore the old Ohio State Penitentiary down. Unfortunately, I don't know why they did that, but because it would have made a great museum. But they were about to throw this away, and Wayne Mott's daddy was there, and he says, "Do you mind if I have this door right here?" And this door, ladies and gentlemen, I thought I had it, is the one that, not to the cell, but to the cell block in which John Hunt Morgan was there. You can still see that door at his museum in Ohio. Read something on him. Ladies and gentlemen, John Hunt Morgan. Thank you very much.